From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, this is Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. This is a podcast about regenerative agriculture, and we like to say that Down to Earth is also a podcast about hope. And I think today's show really brings that home. In a moment, we're going to hear from a man who's devoted his life to restoring watersheds and making dry, unproductive land come to life in a long-term and sustainable way. We'll be back right after these announcements. Stay with us. The Quivira Coalition has a packed workshop schedule, in person and virtually, coming up this February and March. You've got 3 chances to come and learn in person about how to make biochar in Engel, Velarde, and Tajique, New Mexico. Biochar is an important tool for productively dealing with organic wastes such as thinned woods, giving land stewards additional options for mitigating fire risk. Biochar can also be used as a soil amendment that can help build productivity. Additionally, Quivira is partnering with the Southwest Grass-Fed Livestock Alliance on several webinars to support livestock and meat operations. Topics include tax accounting and inventory basics, as well as a study of yield and margin calculation tools. And don't miss a great workshop on how to use land health monitoring data called Connecting the Dots, Effective Land Stewardship Through Monitoring. All workshops are free. Find out more and register at quiviracoalition.org/events. Quivira is spelled Quivira, so quiviracoalition.org/events. And now to our program. I'm delighted now to welcome Zach Weiss. He's a water restoration practitioner and holistic farm planner, and he's worked around the world creating water-abundant, healthy, and resilient landscapes. We're talking to him today as he's about to launch the website waterstories.com. Welcome, Zach Weiss, to Down to Earth.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you are devoting your life and work to restoring watersheds and the water cycle in agricultural land and other landscapes as well, but especially agricultural land. Your mentor in this work was a man named Sepp Holzer, who came from a farming family in Austria. He inherited some land that was not considered good agricultural land. What did he do with it?
You know, he grew up as a child just loving nature and playing with nature, being creative. And so once he inherited it, he started doing all the things he had dreamed of as a child. He started building terraces. He started taking out the pine monoculture and establishing more diverse vegetation. And he really created this farm that some people call the Garden of Eden on Earth, where it's now 72 interconnected ponds and water bodies, produces fish, crawfish, every kind of farm animal, every kind of tree crop you can grow. And it's really just this amazing eco-oasis that's also a financially viable and productive farm.
I mean, when you and I talked the other day, you were saying that the farm is so productive that they're not even able to harvest everything that grows there.
Yeah, it really opens up this whole different strategy where you grow this wealth of diversity. You know, in any given year, sometimes it's going to be really cold, sometimes really warm, sometimes dry, sometimes wet. What they do is, you know, these numbers aren't accurate, but maybe they grow 100 crops every year and harvest 20. So they put their focus into the crops that do really well that year. And so now you can really have a whole different relationship with the weather, where instead of complaining, you're grateful because something had an amazing year because of that weather.
So what are the techniques and practices specifically that he used and that you're using, that you learned from?
Yeah, it really starts with just how the land is receiving water and making sure that water infiltrates into the ground, that it's stored in the ground. You know, on a very steep mountainside farm, water's always running away. So he started with different ways to hold water. He started creating water bodies, ponds. He started making terraces to help infiltrate that. And then he used a lot of the woody debris that he had created from this pine monoculture in a process called hugelkultur, where he buried it, turned it into this rich humic soil, and then that's how he built up his farm.
So that is a relatively wet landscape in Austria, and you talk about the water running down, but he's catching it. You've also worked, and he worked in, and you've studied water restoration in dry landscapes. Tell us about some of those. I know there was some really fascinating projects in Portugal.
Yeah. It's, that was kind of the main ridicule everyone gave Sepp as he started working outside of Austria is, yeah, this works in Austria, great, but it's too dry in these other areas. So in projects like in Spain and in Portugal, even his friends were telling him this isn't going to work here, but the people in those projects believed in him. They put an immense amount of energy into it, and they created these earthen water bodies that, even in places with such a long, hot, dry season, they still get times when they have a lot of rain. And so they're able to hold that water, store it in the ground, store it in the water bodies, recharge the aquifer. And now that community in Portugal went from not having enough water, not knowing if they could even stay there because they were so water scarce, to now they have abundant water. They're off of the deep borehole wells and using shallow springs that are recharged by their own water retention landscape. And they have plenty of water for agriculture and for the community. So it really just night and day changed this scenario. Whereas before, all the water was running away, so it caused a tremendous amount of flooding for the times that it was really rainy. And then because that water didn't infiltrate, they naturally had the drought and water scarcity.
So this is a really important piece of this whole thinking about water, and that is it's not necessarily about how many inches or centimeters of rainfall you get per year, but it's what happens to that rainfall when it hits the ground. And sometimes the amount of rainfall is affected by how the land is managed in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to say it's not so much about how much rain an area receives, but how many times you use it before it leaves.
What does that mean?
In really productive, healthy environments, the water's being cycled through the living systems multiple times before it's continuing downstream. So if you think in a rich forest, that water's hitting vegetation, going into the soil, then it's being consumed by that vegetation, transpired back into the air, and then we're now even understanding that also these forests produce microorganisms that then seed that water vapor back into rain. So it falls again, accounting for 50% of our precipitation in a lot of the world. So the vegetation is actually using the same water multiple times before it goes downstream. Versus you think of like a desert, that water just rushes downstream into the canyons and away towards the ocean, and it's only used by the landscape once. You could argue that it's not even used once.
So vegetation, whether it be a forest or a grassland or agricultural land or whatever, because the water is being used by the plants, it goes up into the atmosphere and falls back down and goes up and falls back down again. You're saying 7 times before it runs downstream.
Now, I should be clear, 7 times is in the most extreme scenario of that, the Amazon rainforest. There it does cycle 7 times, but that is the most extreme example. In a lot of places, it might cycle several times, but not a full 7. It's only in these, rich virgin landscapes that you really achieve that kind of thing. But it also, not only are the vegetation producing microorganisms that seed the rainfall, they're also cooling the ground level all around them, 590 calories per gram of water they transpire. So it's like this huge air conditioner effect that's also generating more rain.
Now, when you say 590 calories per whatever, okay, what does that translate to in real life? Like, let's say you've got an acre of land and you restore that land to improve the water cycle. What's being cooled and by how much?
I think the easiest way to describe it is imagine taking water from close to freezing but liquid all the way to close to boiling. That's an immense amount of energy that's needed for that whole transformation. That is 100 calories per gram that's needed to move water from 1 degree Celsius to 99. It would actually be 98 calories. Now, just to go from vapor to liquid or vice versa, it's either giving off or absorbing 590 calories. So 6 times the energy that water takes to go from near freezing to near boiling is the amount of energy involved in that phase change. So it's really a huge cooling effect. If you think of, we know water is this substance that holds so much heat, but it's even more heat that it holds in those changes between phases.
So again, but what does that mean for a piece of land with lettuce growing on it?
It means cooler temperatures, more humidity, more productive landscapes, really. A great example of this, there's this rabbit-proof fence that they built in Australia where there was a region that had high precipitation. They cleared all the vegetation for agriculture, and it switched. And the region that had previously had less precipitation now had more because that was where the vegetation went. So by destroying the vegetation, they destroyed the rain cycles. And you get into this situation where you have extremes. When it rains, it floods, the temperatures get really cold, and then when it gets hot, there's nothing to buffer that effect, so they heat up and get very hot. So when you have these vegetated landscapes, you're going to have more balanced conditions. You're going to have less flood, less drought, less extreme temperatures, and a more stable, steady living condition.
And so that's what's behind one of the main principles in regenerative agriculture, namely no bare ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another piece of this that's very interesting in that the temperature of the ground really impacts how well it can absorb the rain. So in a really hot ground, most of that rain is runoff, whereas when that ground is at a cooler temperature, slightly moist, if you imagine like a sponge, when it's totally dry, the water just runs right off of it. But when it's cool and moist, it can absorb that. Same thing's happening with our soil. So when we have bare exposed ground, none of that water can infiltrate, whereas if we have any degree of vegetation, and then the more vegetation, the better, it allows that infiltration into the soils and recharge of the aquifers.
So the work you do and the work that Sepp Holzer and other people who we might talk about today do when they're restoring water cycles on land that's been damaged or degraded or land that wasn't considered so great in the first place, it's all fairly low-tech work. Is that right? What do you actually do? What kind of tools do you use?
Yeah, it's very low tech. It's really just figuring out what's going on with the natural situation and then what lever points can we move to improve the scenario. So we might look at a property and see erosion gullies opening up and all of the water running off and find ways to retain that water so that we're reducing the amount of erosion, but we're also holding that water for later on in the year. You know, it really is a custom tailored solution to each place. Sometimes we're using big equipment and making water bodies that are helping infiltrate that water into the earth. Sometimes we're making terraces. Sometimes we're just suggesting management changes or different ways of managing vegetation. Sometimes it's as simple as stop trapping the beavers and let them restore the water landscape that used to be here. If we just let the beavers come back, they would do this work around the US all on their own. But, you know, they'd cause us a lot of damage to infrastructure in the process, which is why we don't let that process happen. But it's all a matter of meeting the goals of the people with the natural tendencies of that landscape.
Once you do a project of this kind, what kind of maintenance does it need after that?
Yeah, what I really pride myself on is setting up situations and solutions that are going to last until the next ice age. And so really, you know, you ultimately get out what you put into it. So if someone just wants a really healthy, vibrant landscape that's recharging the aquifer, there's almost no maintenance needed to these. You know, you need to occasionally check the spillways, make sure nothing's getting totally out of place, but they're really designed in a way that nature would have created them, and so they age with the same slow processes. But if you want a rich landscape that's producing lots of food, you have to put some work in. If you put very little work in, you'll still get some food out, but if you put a little bit of maintenance and energy and care into it, you're going to get 10, 20, 100 times more. So I'd say there's almost no maintenance required, but when you do put in some love and care, it just goes that much further.
Can you give us an example of, let's say, a farm or a ranch that you have worked on and sort of walk us through that process?
Yeah. One in Oregon in the wine growing region, lovely farm called Tabula Rasa. And so they were just starting out when we started going there, and they had no water. They wanted to create a farm, but they weren't able to because you'd think Oregon's very water rich, but the aquifers there are so degraded. It's actually really hard to find water in the ground. So she drilled, I think, 5 different wells, eventually dousing her own to get a 1/4 gallon a minute. So enough to build a home, but not enough to have a farm, her whole vision. And so what we did over time, over the course of, 5 years now, is we've implemented more and more water retention throughout the landscape. So now the animals have plenty of water, but we're also restoring the health of the pastures. Whereas these pastures used to be grazed once or twice, and that was all the food you could really get off of them. Now they're moving the animals through 3, 4 times because we're infiltrating so much more water, we're creating more forage for them. So we've really done a lot there, and it's actually moving towards an education center and a hospitality place for people to come learn about these techniques. But that gives you just a little taste of what we've been up there.
And so you dug holes that were like, you made ponds?
Yeah, I would absolutely call them ponds. The important thing is that they're keyway water retention features. So we're actually tying them into the hydrology of the ground versus making a liner pond or even a clay line pond. We're finding where the natural veins are and then helping recharge those veins by holding water in key points. So we've maybe created, 10 or 12 different water bodies throughout the landscape. Some as these more intensive water bodies, and then some are just beaver mimicry features. In areas where we can't make permanent water storage, we can make permeable structures, fascines and beaver dam analogs, things that help that water slowly reconnect with its floodplain, but aren't impermeable structures, so they don't trigger the regulations that fall into working within waterways.
So the vision that you have is, and you call it this, a decentralized vision. So a vision of having, let's say, several hundred small ponds on a landscape as opposed to one big reservoir. What's the difference between those two scenarios?
Yeah, that's a great question and something we get a lot because, while I'm very pro these small decentralized earthen dams, I'm really against big dams, and people can struggle to understand that. But it has a really big difference in its impact on the landscape. If you look at centralized systems, there's a lot of loss everywhere in the centralization of that. So these big dams, they're actually draining the aquifer further up to divert water to the dam to then hold it, to pulse it artificially through the waterways based on electricity needs, and then pipe it downstream. So whereas this water used to touch so many parts of the landscape moving through it, it now straight lines to the reservoir and then goes down pipes and canals to where it's used. So what we advocate for is something very different, where we're decentralizing that. We're trying to make as many small water bodies throughout the landscape as possible. And the big difference is then it's not this feast or famine mentality. You're seeing this more and more with our dams, particularly in the American West. We drain all the water down in the spring, and then there's no recharge to those reservoirs throughout the year. It goes dry, and we just have what we have. If we took a different approach and we used that water more times through the landscape, infiltrated it up high in those catchments instead of draining it downstream, we'd have water still feeding into those reservoirs throughout the year. So you don't get into these same water scarcity issues. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, you're stopping the water, you're taking the water from the reservoir. We're not actually taking it, we're just slowing down how long it takes to get there. So in the long term, we're creating more water for the reservoir because we're recharging springs, we're creating more earthen water retention uphill that's slowly leaking into that reservoir. Yes, in that first rainy season, that water is held, but it's for a better positive result in the end. Whereas dams, we see this slow or even quick atrophy of the health of the waterways year after year because of the way they artificially regulate the water.
And that speaks to the difference between a kind of mechanistic paradigm when we think about water versus an ecosystem-based paradigm. And the first is kind of a zero-sum way of thinking about it, and the second really isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's anything I've learned working with natural systems, it's that we do not, nor will we ever fully understand them. And so as humans, we like to take on this mechanistic view of we understand all the details and we can build these models and predict things, but it never actually holds up well in reality because there's all these variables we don't understand. And when we work with water, when we work with nature, we're tapping into this perpetual motion machine that if we just set it off in the right direction, it's going to continue in that direction of its own accord. And so it's really about, just like you said, reframing our attitude and relationship with water and nature.
There's a story of a doctor in India who went to the countryside as a doctor, and he ended up restoring the water cycle there because the shortage of water was the greatest impediment to people's health. This is somebody that you've also worked with. Tell us that story.
Yeah, Dr. Rajendra Singh, amazing story in India where all of the people had moved away from these villages because there was no water, there was no employment, there was nothing. So it was only the old and the sick people suffering from night blindness. He moved to this area, and it was actually one of the elders in the village that showed him, if you want to help us, don't give us medicine, give us water. When we had water, when we had agriculture, we could buy the medicines we needed. And so this old man showed him how to revive their traditional water structures. Because what happened in India is, in colonization, they brought water to everyone, and they stopped managing the traditional water harvesting structures. So the landscape dried out, it aridified, farmland desertified. And what this elder in the village showed Rajendra was how to revive these traditional structures. So he built the first Johad, which is the same kind of earthen water body, water retention body that we're creating. And then they saw that it recharged water in the downstream well. And so slowly, over 35 years, this spread to a movement that really accomplished some incredible things. They went from 2% greenery to 48% greenery in this region of Rajasthan. They lowered the temperature 2 degrees Celsius. They revived 7 rivers to perennial flow. They brought water back to 250,000 wells, impacting 1 million people, causing the reverse migration from the cities back to the countrysides. So it's this really incredible story of communities, not governments, not big organizations or NGOs, but communities standing together to restore the health of their landscape.
And the people in the communities did the actual work, the digging and so on.
Exactly. And these are people with nothing in India doing these projects by hand or with a single machine, and really incredible the scale of projects that they've done. But it is the community's work. The community gathers in these water councils, decides what can be done, and then Tarun Bharat Sangh, Rajendra's organization, helps provide them guidance in that whole process.
One of the things that I found shocking about that story was that instead of being lauded, he was punished for doing that work.
Yeah, at one point he had 72 legal cases against him. He was under house arrest. The government
Why?
actually sold the fishing rights to the water bodies that the people had made. And it's because, this takes money out of the pockets of the wealthy, and it takes control out of the wealthy, because these water bodies were impeding water from flowing to the dams and reservoirs that the governments control. And it was also making these communities water independent, where they didn't need to buy water anymore. So it's kind of a lot of mischief at foot. And eventually he was absolved of all of these charges. A leader in India saw what he had done and said, "Rajendra, why are you causing me so much trouble?" And Rajendra said, "Oh, you know me, I'm a Gandhian. I can't cause any trouble. I'm just doing the right thing." And, eventually this person wiped away all of the issues. But still, it's just asinine that this person that caused so much good actually had so much legal grief as a result.
And he's not a unique case.
No, the whole no good deed goes unpunished. You look at Sepp Holzer, one of the most fine farmers in Austria. You look at Peter Marshall, all these people that have made these really amazing progressions. Oftentimes our legal systems are so antiquated, they don't allow for these more progressive ways of doing things. And so they actually levy huge fines. And, Sepp was constantly at risk of losing his farm for many years until he was finally able to overcome the government pressure.
This was your friend in Austria.
Yeah.
It's quite amazing, especially when you consider things like wildfire and the role of restoring the water cycle in preventing these huge catastrophic crown fires.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it really bothers me that we have so quickly accepted this fire regime as normal, When, even just 10 years ago, we weren't having these huge scale horrific fires with smoke in the air for months on end. And from my view, it is very clearly from the desertification of the landscape. If you dry out the landscape, you get drier landscapes that burn more easily. And there are really easy ways to move away from this as well, as soon as people know and start acting in that direction.
Have you seen the way that restoration of the water cycle helps when a wildfire does come?
Yeah, a great example of this is another friend of mine in Australia. His name is Peter Marshall. And he took over this. It was actually an old gold mine that had one tree on it. They had dredged the whole landscape down to bedrock, drained it all away to mine the gold. And he stored water on the landscape. He created these water bodies. He replanted the forests. You wouldn't even imagine that it was a gold mine before, that it was a denuded landscape, because it's literally a water forest landscape now. And now in Braidwood, he had the fires circle around him for 2 months, coming in from every direction. Because of the way he had managed the forest, he had limbed up the trees, so there was no ability for the fire to ladder up the crowns of the trees. And he had created such a fungally dominant, healthy soil that was still moist even after all those droughts. So he was literally taking crown fires to ground fires, where it was burning through the whole tree to where he was just able to put it out with a shovel. And so he did very much actively defend his property, but he was the only one of his neighbors that didn't burn. Everyone else ashes. And another big piece of that puzzle was he had planted all of these fire retardant species, these water-loving trees like willow. When a fire comes upon a willow, the willow in self-defense drops all of the water it's holding.
What do you mean drops the water?
It flushes it into the atmosphere. So it basically just, I don't know if it's actually a biological or physical mechanism, but somehow the water that's in that tree goes into the air, retarding that fire, essentially. And so the fireys that saw this firsthand, a lot of them had their life saved by this, said that it seemed to do more than any fire truck could. And this is something that was actually used even in France a long time ago. They had these railway poplars. When there was coal-fired railroads and they were lighting fires all over the place, they planted these railway poplars all along the edges of the railroads to extinguish these embers. So he's also paid huge amounts of fines for having those willows, because in Australia, they view them as an invasive species. You're supposed to ring bark them, cut them down, and poison them. But they were actually what saved his property from burning when push came to shove.
A moment ago, you said something like he limbed the trees or limbed up the trees. What does that mean?
Yeah. So what limbed up means is that he cleared the bottom branches of the trees. So this is something that's often done in agroforestry. When you want to produce a good wood out of it, you'll cut the lower limbs so that there's no knots in that wood, and you'll cut them early. And so he had done that for reasons of wood production as part of his agroforestry system, but it also helps absolve that fire laddering. When that fire moves in, if it doesn't have dry branches at the bottom to move up the trunk, it can't usually just burn right up the trunk. It needs those branches and that tinder to actually move into the crown of that tree. So by limbing up the bottom branches up, the first 12 feet or 3 meters or so, you really reduce that fire laddering potential.
So the projects that we're talking about, some of them, like the project in India, ended up being, pretty large scale. Many of them are smaller scales, a farm here, a ranch there, things like that. But how do you see the potential for climate change mitigation of this work, and what kind of scale would be required to actually allow this to have a global effect?
Yeah, that's where this gets really exciting, because when you work with water, you see the results in the first rainy season. So specifically when you look at the issue of climate change, we know that between 70 to 95% of Earth's heat dynamics are regulated by water. Now, water is not very present in the climate change discussion because we set it as a constant at the beginning. It's too complicated to model, so we said our impact is neutral. But we know that we've desertified 1/3 of all of Earth's land in just 10,000 years. So we have a decidedly not neutral impact. So when we change our thinking, and focus more on water, we do things that create meaningful results quickly. And so what we see time and time again is we do one project and then the neighbors see it and they want to do it, and then their neighbors see it and they want to do it. So it tends to really spread through any area once you establish an on the ground example. And so I see tremendous hope and potential. It's not it's not at all unrealistic for us to solve extreme climate, extreme temperature, the most severe impacts that we're seeing today in terms of flood, drought, and fire, all within less than 10 years if we actually put our efforts in the right direction. And this is something that can be done on a big scale, like you mentioned, on a community-wide scale, and also can be done on a home scale. If you look at a little postage stamp lot, every postage stamp lot is creating a ton of runoff from the roof of the house, from the driveway, the roads. How can we take that runoff we're created and find ways to put it into the ground, into the soil? As soon as we do that, we have more vegetative growth immediately on site and downstream in the watershed. We have more of this vegetative cooling potential. We have more consistent rains being created as a result, and we can very quickly get back to a stable and productive environment.
What does that mean actually for people living in cities where they have a little lot, or suburbs where they might have a slightly larger piece of property that has a lawn on it or something like that? Like, what kind of changes do you recommend that people make?
Rain gardens are a great place to start. And it's really as simple as make a hole in the earth where that rainwater that's running off can infiltrate. Now, if you can hold water on that landscape for longer, even better. Now you're creating a reservoir for birds, for insects, for all the life that we need to support a healthy planet. And so really it's pollinator habitat, it's low management landscapes. If you look at, a lawn that's mowed is relatively little environment and photosynthetic potential. If we can instead get a multi-tiered growing system where we have some trees, some shrubs, some layers underneath that, we now have a much more productive landscape as a net result. So, what it really looks like is rain gardens, is low maintenance gardens, xeriscaping. I don't really like the whole stone your whole yard, because that, again, doesn't really allow for great infiltration and doesn't allow for this vegetative effect. But if we can create more natural landscapes within the suburbs, it's also going to help reduce the heat island effect in the extreme temperatures that we experience, both locally for the person living in that house and for that community at a large if people start doing it on a bigger scale.
We're not there yet, clearly, in terms of a widespread understanding of how the water cycle works and how it can be used to improve farms and, as you're talking about, mitigate climate change, all of that. Part of what you're doing is you are basically launching a site called waterstories.com to really help people to understand all of this better. Tell us about that project.
Yeah, so I've seen just this incredible transformation that's possible all around the world. We've created this for people, and I'm in so much demand, it's just insane. It's kind of driving me crazy. And so Water Stories is really about two things. It's about bringing this story of water to the masses so that people understand. It's so easy to get so depressed and disillusioned when you hear all the mainstream narratives, but in fact there's real tangible things we all can do to make a better common future. So a big part of it is just getting that story out and creating a new mythology that humans aren't just destroyers, we're also creators, and we could have a really big role in the restoration of the Earth's biosystems. And then another big part of Water Stories is about training practitioners, training people to do exactly what I do, what Sepp Holzer does, what Rajendra Singh does. And so we're taking all these learnings that I've gained from all of these water masters and putting them into a cohesive, digestible package so that ideally in the coming years we have thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands or even millions of people earning their livelihood by restoring the water cycle.
One of the things that you've mentioned is quite satisfying is the fact that you see the results very quickly of that work.
Absolutely. And it really enables this feedback loop that makes sense for humans. When we look at carbon capture, I think it's hard for people to get excited about because we don't even know if it's working for 20 or 50 years. Whereas when you work with water, the first rainy season, you see the impacts, you see the life that is on that landscape as a result of your own actions. And the feeling this gives you is just incredible because now, you can leave behind this narrative that humans are destructive by nature, that we're destroying the world. It's all going to be this horrific, sci-fi movie in the future because we can have a really meaningful impact on the living ecosystems around us.
What do you think it would take for governments and policymakers to understand this kind of thinking and what's in the way? I mean, you gave a hint of it when you talked about what happened in India, where, the wealthy class was very much against it.
Yeah, I mean, just to be blunt about it, what's in the way is water privatization. When you look at the basic economics of it in a water scarce world, water business is incredibly lucrative. In a water abundant world where everyone has ample water supplies, water is not lucrative at all. So these organizations, these businesses, these governments that are privatizing water supplies are actually putting them in a situation where they're now going to be managing the system for economic gain, which means ecological scarcity. And so, I'm pretty disillusioned about government. I think the only way this is going to change is by the people coming together and saying, we have control in this scenario. We're the people living on the landscape. We're going to heal the landscape. And this is what they did in India, and they did it successfully, where the government sold the fishing rights to the water bodies they built, but then the people petitioned the government and said, no, it's actually us that you need rights from if you're going to fish our waters. And because it was all of these communities standing together in unity, they were able to overcome that immense government pressure. So I think governments will only do it retroactively once people force them to. And that's why this awareness campaign of water stories is something I've put so much energy and effort into.
Do you see this positively affecting the profits of farmers and ranchers whom you've worked with?
Oh, big time. Big time. Another example, I think, that really hits this on the head, another friend of mine, Martin Royds in Australia, he's, again, created this decentralized water retention landscape. Now, at the end of a horrific 2-year drought, the water supply for the city, this big river, was running dry. The city was about to run out of water, and they hadn't received rains in 2 years. Yet his water retention landscape was still discharging water into the creek. So when everyone was taking water out of the river was running dry, he was still putting water back into the creek, and he actually offered up his water supply to the town because they had no water. So, that's an example that's really extreme because it involves our immediate survival in terms of water. But if you imagine a difference between a farmer having water and a farmer not having water, water is the ultimate capital that every farmer is farming. We're farming land, we're farming crops, but it's all actually based on water. And so if we're really water scarce, we're never going to be able to earn or generate that much. Whereas when you push that scarcity to abundance, we see a huge transformation in the quality of people's lives, but also the economic abundance they have as well.
I would think that one of the reasons that this kind of work is so much in demand is that it ends up paying for itself fairly quickly.
Absolutely. One of these projects in India, it was a community that had run out of water. They had drilled 27 boreholes, all of which were dry. For that same cost, they created one water body, and they went from 9 hectares of agriculture to 650. They paid for the cost of the dam 4 times over the first year in their increase in agricultural productivity. So they went from 1 crop a year on 9 hectares to 2 to 4 crops a year on 650 hectares. So you can really see quickly how it pays back in a real meaningful way pretty quickly.
Are you involved in training people to do this kind of work? Do you find a lot of interest among young people who want to get into this?
Yeah, tremendous interest. I'd say that's our second most common thing people contact us about, because a lot of people want to do this exact work. And so they go to university, they get an environmental engineering degree, and they learn none of this. They learn nothing that can actually help heal the planet. So there's an immense demand for it, and that's why we've created this core course to really train these people, empower them, prepare them to be practitioners, not just to be able to do the work, but to actually make a livelihood doing the work as well.
So if people want to find out more information, they should go to waterstories.com?
So we're just about to launch our proper community and content, but if people visit the website, waterstories.com, and subscribe for the newsletter, they'll get an early invitation to this community, also an invitation to the upcoming live event for the release we're going to have on the 16th of February, and they'll also be updated of all of the great content we have coming over the next couple of months.
Anything else you want to talk about before we go?
I think the biggest thing I'd like to leave people with is just, it's really beyond hope. When you see these projects firsthand, you understand that there is a very clear, proven pathway towards an abundant, healthy earth. And it's really just a matter of gaining this exposure, gaining this awareness where more people know about these projects, experience them firsthand, spread the word within their communities. Because once we're aware of this, we're going to be able to move very quickly in a very positive direction.
Zach Weiss restores watersheds and farms and ranches, and you can find his work at waterstories.com. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This program is produced in collaboration with the Quivira Coalition, a non-for-profit educational organization and community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to the resilience of arid working lands. Their work aims to shift current practices of agriculture and land stewardship to those that produce good food, support meaningful livelihoods in rural places, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira, coalition.org. You've been listening to Down to Earth, a production of the Quivira Coalition and the Radio Cafe. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. If you like this program, please share it with your network. And we'd love your feedback. Go to downtoearth.media, where you can contact us and you can sign up for the mailing list. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We're producing this show bi-weekly and would love your comments and ideas. So once again, downtoearth.media. And check out the Quivira Coalition, quiviracoalition.org. That's Quivira. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.